Hey guys, so there was a recent balance patch that came out today, and with it came some, disappointing changes. Condi Rev, Hollow, most of the broken stuff didn't really get nerfed, but Necromancers did get pretty good changes. I mean, Necromancer didn't really need it, so it's whatever, but, Scourge has their shades skills occur on themselves now as well as at the location. Chronos have illusionary persona again, so there's a lot of good changes there, but also the nerf that we want weren't really there. But anyways, what did come from this patch is something really good, and that is an archetype for a build that I've been trying to make work for a really long time is now able to be played. This is a Condi Reaper. That's right. This is called the Lich King because you control your foes through their veins with chill and weakness, and you really debilitate them and take control of them. So the idea is, normal Condi Reaper, you're going to be using Deathly Chill, so whenever you chill someone, you put bleed on them. And it's also a wizard amulet build, so there's a lot of power damage involved as well. So you're using speed rune, you have a lot of swiftness from your speed of shadows trait, and that's going to be really good for letting you move around, and mobility is king for necros for their survivability, right? Because not being focused is probably one of the best ways to survive because necros are easily focused. So speed of shadows is a really good trait, and unfortunately you do have to give up soul marks for it, but I think it's really necessary because speed of shadows is just so good. It removes all those movement inhibiting conditions when you enter shroud, and then it gives you swiftness, which gives you really increased movement speed with rune of speed. And you're using Scepter and Dagger. So Scepter Dagger is really good because there are corrupts on it, there's a lot of weakness on Dagger, and there's also a blind and condition transfer on the Deathly Swarm. And blind is really good with this build because you have chilling darkness. So whenever you blind a target, you'll also chill. And that's on a 3-second ICD. And it's also just really good because this build doesn't take blood magic. And blood magic is where a lot of necromancers get their Condi cleanse. And also you're not taking plague sending. You can take plague sending, by all means take it, but I find that chilling darkness is just way more damage output, and plague sending is kind of unreliable sometimes because if you go in shroud and then your first attack misses, then you won't get the transfer, and sometimes transferring something isn't really that useful. So I like chilling darkness because there are a lot of ways you can get blind from Deathly Swarm, you have Well of Darkness, and your Shroud 2 is also a blind. So yeah, there's a lot of ways you can get blind out, and that means you also get chill out. Chill is really nice because it gives you bleeding, right? And that's extra damage. And just chill in general is just such a debilitating condition. It reduces their cooldown, or increases their cooldown recharges, and it makes them so slow and easy to focus. So it's just such a strong condition. So yeah, and then obviously you have corrupt on your Scepter, so that's just corrupts on your Dagger and Scepter is really good because it's more cover Condis. So I take Agony and Exposure. So because this is a wizard amulet build, you're using both Condi and power. So vulnerability gives you power, and Condi damage increases. So that's always good on necros that are hybrid to have exposure sigil. And I use Sigil of Agony because you're doing a lot of bleed with this build, and that increases your bleeding duration by 25%. So it's really nice with Dagger and Scepter skills, and then any chill that you do will do more damage because of that, or last longer and potentially deal more damage. Then on Staff, you have energy and cleansing. So the reason why I have Staff on this build instead of the Axe Focus or the Axe Warhorn, which I was trying a lot in the past to make work, is simply because Staff is just a better weapon overall. You lose out on having a lot of corrupts because you don't have the Axe and the Focus or Warhorn, but I think staff is better for just poking. And how this build is going to play out is you kind of like go in shroud whenever you can, and then you leave shroud, and then you just spam all of your weapon skills, and then you go back in shroud. And that kind of works out really well with staff, because staff has the extra range that you need in certain situations. It lets you to engage on most situations very well, because it's the longest range, weapon probably in the game, other than like the ranger longbow, because the staff marks are 1200 range, but then they have like a radius, and your range is at the middle of that radius. So the half of that radius is added on to your range, right? So it's just a really good sort of weapon for getting the jump on any engagement. Just such a good weapon. And even though you're not using soul marks, you don't really need that, because you're getting your life force from eternal life, and the unblockable, that's really good, and there's really no unblockable in this build because you're not taking soul marks, but I think that it's really necessary for Speed of Shadows. You can, however, take soul marks if you really want unblockable. But anyways, I take energy cleansing on my staff, because usually when you go to staff, you're usually kiting or something like that, and this build isn't really too heavy on the Condi cleanse, so that's why I take Cleansing Sigil. So let's go to the traits more specifically. So curses, Soul Reaping, and Reaper. Soul Reaping is very good with any kind of Reaper build, because you want to have as much Shroud and to last as long in Shroud as possible, because Reaper Shroud has the highest degeneration of any of the other Shrouds, right? So you don't stay in it as long as like a Core Necro. So that's really important on pretty much all Reaper builds. And I take Speed of Shadows, right, which is really good, and you get Vital Persistence as well. So you might think, well, why don't you take Fear of Death and then Terror? Well, the duration of Reaper Fears isn't really that long. It's just nice to get Fear application in general, because whenever you fear someone, you get Chill. And so that makes all of your fears do damage, because that gives out bleeding. So in general, you don't need more fear you need fear application, not fear duration. And terror and Fear of Death are more about the duration of your fears, so it's not as important. And Vital Persistence is really good, because this build is kind of lacking on the self-sustain, because you're not going blood magic. So it is kind of nice to have Vital Persistence. And obviously Soul Barbs is kind of for more power-oriented specs. Then you have Eternal Life, which is really important for this build in my opinion, because whenever you go in Shroud, you often aren't going to really have that much Shroud, so the extra protection while you're in Shroud allows you to kind of like shrug off more damage, and that means that you maintain more of your Shroud so that you can stay in as long as possible, but also because it gives you up to like 20% of your Shroud whenever you're not in Shroud. So that means that every time you leave Shroud, you can always know that in 9 seconds, right, that's the cooldown of Shroud, you can go back into Shroud, because it just generates it for free, and it also does it out of combat. So what that means is you'll never enter a fight with no Shroud, and that makes it a lot more reliable for you to survive if you get jumped or something, or like at the beginning of a match when you haven't hit anything and haven't gotten Shroud yet. So that's just really good, and especially really good for a Reaper, because you can travel around the map using your Shroud. So you can go in Shroud and use your 2 skill, which is a leap, and you'll also get swiftness, and then you can immediately leave Shroud. You don't have to feel bad about wasting Shroud, because you'll just get it back, unless of course you're above the threshold, then you've got a decent amount of Shroud anyways. So I really like Eternal Life. Death Perception and Doomfire are really not that good, because you're not staying in Shroud long enough to get really value from Doomfire, and Death Perception is more about like power and crit builds, and that can be good with hybrid a little bit. So if you really want more damage, you can go Death Perception, but Eternal Life really is necessary for the sustain of this build, because you're not really going into blood magic, so you gotta make up for that with Eternal Life. And then in Curses, this is also a really important trait line, because Curses is kind of like the hybrid trait line, because you have minor traits like Target the Weak, where you have more crit chance the more conditions are on your target, and you have a lot of conditions with this build because you have corrupts and you have weakness, chill, bleed, just so many conditions because you have a lot of ways to corrupt conditions, and you can get like confusion sometimes. You get blinding as well, a lot we talked about. So you get more crit chance, and you, for more like the more precision you have, right, you also get condition damage. So it's sort of like your power helps your condi and your condi helps your power is kind of what the idea there is. And also you gain fury when you enter shroud, which is really nice because it doesn't really work with this trait, but it is nice because you do want to be critting as often as possible because of bard precision. So your bleeding duration is increased, which is nice because you're doing a lot of bleeds. And whenever you crit, you have a 33% chance to bleed for like 1 second. It's not really that long, but it is pretty good. So your bleeding duration it's actually, I'm not on a Scepter right now. It should be 45% bleed duration, which is your main damaging condition on this build. So you have a 1 second bleed that goes up to like 1.5 seconds. Whenever you crit, you have 33% chance, and that's kind of decent, right? It adds a little bit of damage. So we talked about chilling darkness. Path of corruption is really important too. So whenever you go in shroud, your 2 skill will corrupt 2 boons on the final hit. So it does like this weird like leap that hits many times, but then the final hit, which has a really high power modifier to it, also converts 2 conditions, and that's really good because that is a huge condi nuke. So not only does your shroud 2 blind, which gives chill, which gives bleeding, right? So you give 3 condis there, right there, and then you corrupt 2 boons into conditions. So that's potentially another 2 conditions. So that's like 5 conditions there from your shroud 2. That's a huge nuke. And that's really good for making this kind of like build into a more hybrid build, right? Because you have Soul Spiral, which is your kind of like heavy power and poison damage. And then you have your Shroud 2, which does really heavy power damage and then gives out a lot of condis. And then obviously in Shroud you have your 3 skill, which would give out Fear, which gives out Chill, which gives out Bleeding. And then you also have in Shroud, you have your Executioner's Scythe, and that leaves a chill field on the ground. And I'll show you guys how to use that, right? So like the chill field on the ground will constantly tick chill, which gives out bleeding, but then you can also whirl in it, and whirl finisher of chill can give out a lot of bleed. So you can do something like this, and you can see the bleeds are just going up really high there. So it's really important to kind of combo your 5 and your 4 like that to get a lot of bleed. So that's kind of important because a lot of your damage has to come from your shroud. So where was I? So lastly is weakening shroud. So whenever you crit, you will give out weakness for 2.5 seconds, and that's on a 10-second ICD. And that's really good because that's one way to counter power builds, and it's really important that you crit, right? Because if you don't crit, then you're not going to give weakness. So it really works out for a hybrid build to play curses because you won't get the weakness then. And then also when you enter shroud, you will leave sort of like a dagger. So like you have 2 dagger 5s sort of. So you use dagger 5, which looks like this, and then when you enter shroud, you also do another dagger 5, and that is it's kind of like a lesser enfeeble, right? But it does similar, it actually does more weakness than the actual enfeebling blood, but it does a little bit less bleeding. So this is really good because 6 seconds of weakness is super important, and it converts a boon into a condition, which is also really good. So when you go in shroud, you can do, so what you'll do is you'll leave a weakening shroud, lesser enfeeble where you enter into shroud. That will give bleeding and weakness, and then that will corrupt a boon into a condition. So that's 3 conditions right there. And then you can immediately press your Shroud 2, which will give another, bunch of conditions right there. And as you can see, I gave vulnerability 2 because of my exposure sigil. And yeah, it's just a huge nuke that you can do by just going into Shroud and pressing your 2 skill. So yeah, and I'm not even converting any boons into conditions there. So it's just a heavy burst that you can do with this build. So yeah, that's really important to kind of like position where you enter into Shroud so that your Enfeeble lands in that area. And yeah, that's pretty much the traits for Curses and Soul Reaping. In Reaper, I go with Chilling Nova, obviously, so you need like a hybrid build for this trait as well, because you need to crit a foe who is chilled, and that'll land another chill on them, which is just more bleeding and more chill duration. So this is just really good for the synergy of the build. You have more chill when you fear. You have Life Force when you hit a foe who is chilled, and you gain might as well. So this is kind of important. Even though you have Eternal Life to give you your Shroud, you kind of need a little bit more of that Shroud generation to kind of like stay in Shroud as long as possible. And obviously Decimate Defenses is kind of nice, but you don't really need that. And Soul Eater is more for like power builds. So obviously this is the best choice, and it kind of helps you to stay in Shroud a little bit longer so that you can land a little bit more of your Shroud combos. And then you have increased chill duration and 10% damage increase to chilled foes. So this is really nice for the hybrid aspect as well, because you do power and you do condition. And then obviously we talked about Deathly Chill. So that's pretty much the traits and all that. I take Consume conditions, so you can actually take Master of Corruption if you want, and that'll make this a 20-second cooldown heal, which is actually really strong, right? Your heal being 20 seconds is super strong, because most heals are like 30 seconds. And this is a huge Condi cleanse. So actually, Path of Corruption can be swapped for Master of Corruption, but the thing is, you do put blind on yourself, which can kind of be annoying, and you are giving up the huge double condition conversion with your 2 skill in Shroud. So yeah, that is it's a pretty hard choice to make, honestly. I wouldn't put it against you if you wanted to take Master of Corruptions instead, like if you're against a lot of Condis, or you feel like you're not going to get a lot of sustain from your team and you need more support for yourself, then sure, go Master of Corruptions. And yeah, so this is the best heal, obviously. Well of Darkness has also been buffed, so it gives Blind for 3 seconds every pulse, and Chill for 2 seconds. And obviously that's increased by the Reaper traits. So this well actually does a ton of damage now, because it, as you can see, it does like 2,000 damage. It'll do Blind, which will give you Chill on a 3-second ICD, and then it'll give you Chill, which will give you another Chill. So that's a lot of bleeding there. So you can just see here, I put down the well, and yeah, it just gives out a ton of bleeding, and it's also proccing out some of my what was that, the Chilling Nova procced. So I got 8 bleeding from just putting down my Well of Darkness, and that's a lot of damage. So and obviously it's Chilling, which is a really strong condition, and Blind, which is a very defensive condition. So yeah, Well of Darkness, absolutely necessary in this build. Next is Spectral Walk. This is pretty standard. This skill is very strong. It allows you to juke people. It gives you a little bit more of the swiftness duration if you don't get enough from going in Shroud from Speed of Shadows. And it also cleanses Condis, because you don't really have that much. Also, Will of Power. Yeah, I decided to take Will of Power because even though this isn't really like a build that wants to stay in place, it is very good support for your team in team fights, and that's kind of what a Necro is supposed to do, go into team fights. And you can replace this for things like your all weaklings, or even use the Worm, or some other kind of stun break or Condi cleanse. That would be fine. I just chose Well of Power, but that's like my third utility. Anything can kind of go there. And then lastly, we have Lich form, because this is the Lich King, and Lich is just really good. You can fear with the 3 skill, and that'll give a lot of damage, because it'll do, a nice little chill there when you fear, and then what you want to do is just spam 1 and 2 non-stop, because your 2 skill in Shroud or in Lich is like the small little animation that like cripples and puts 1 stack of Vuln. That's just really good for removing Aegis and stuff like that. And your 1 skill is your heavy nuke, right? So what I do when I'm in Lich, I just mash my 1 and 2 skill like this, and yeah, you just spam, because the 2 skill is going to be able to be used constantly, and the 1 skill is able, like, that's your auto attack. It's a range auto attack, and you just kind of run around using the Lich, and you use your 3 skill if you think that they're going to stand still and get feared, and that'll do a huge nuke. Then you just spam 1 and 2. The 5 and the 4 skill, you kind of just use those if you've got nothing better to do. If like someone's blocking or you can't see anyone, figure that out. But anyways, yeah, so that's pretty much the idea of the build. You open up on people with your chill blends, which will put chill, and then you can proc from that your chilling nova, so you'll get chill into chill, and then from there you can also fear them for another chill. You do want to save your 4 for like a Condi cleanse usually, but you can just use it for damage sometimes. It does pretty heavy damage if it crits. And then from there you want to go in with your 2. You can honestly just do 2, 3, 4, 5, and then as soon as you do that, you want to like kind of get into melee range with your Shroud. Press your 2 skill, press your 3, and then fear into your 5, and then do your whirly in that, and then you can probably do your 2 skill again in your ice field, and that'll give you a frost aura, and if someone hits you when you have frost aura on, that'll chill them, and chill gives bleed, so you have kind of like this bleed aura on you, which is really good. So yeah, that's pretty much the idea of the build, and yeah.